Gwynna Ushla, Manam Cardi Golair, Cade Mila Falchion Shohanu. Ladies and gentlemen, saints and sinners, welcome to the first inaugural Mise Éire Festival in Castlebar. Conde Wayo! Mise Éire. Shinna me no achalioch vera. Me a rog cu colin croiga. Mo glor. Mo nor mo clan fein a yilo waher. Mo fian bit nierte de mo hir kiapo. Mo vron dieg an dramen a curastocus. Mise Éire uigni me no an chalioch vera. Mise Éire. Is tossa Éire. Is muige Éire. Éire abu. I am Ireland. I am older than the old crone of Bera. Great my glory, I who bore Cuchulainn the valiant. Great my shame, my own children that sold her mother. Great my pain, my irreconcilable enemy who harasses me continuously. Great my sorrow, the crowd in whom I placed trust died. I am Ireland. I am lonelier than the old crone of Bera. I am Ireland. You are Ireland. We are Ireland. Ireland forever to victory. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get things rolling with the first panel discussion. Please let me introduce the amazing Tracy Thorndike.
Keeping with the theme of Pearse's poem, Mise Éire, John, where do you see Pearse's vision still echoing, and where has Ireland drifted from it today?
The first thing I'd say is that Mise Éire is not exactly a kind of an expression of Pearse's vision in toto. It's a particular element of the story leading up to the Rising. It's an old medieval poem about the crone of the old hag of Bera, this Irish goddess who is talking about, she's growing old and she's talking about her life. And Pearse picks up this concept and makes it a poem about Ireland looking at its state of unfreedom. If you notice, the poem is a kind of a downward cascade from glory back down to pain. And you could even add in the modern day another line, probably to do with apprehension and about the future and the future of our children. So that it's a very dark poem, and it was written, I think, in 1912, which was before he wrote the essays which are in this book. It's a book of those essays which are really beautiful and extraordinary essays, and I think very important for people to read in advance of the Rising. You know, the coming revolution, the separatist idea, the spiritual nation, the murder machine, all those beautiful essays. This is an old edition I've had. My father bought it in an auction many years ago with lots of other books, which saved my life. But there's a great Mise Éire Press edition available of those essays now, and it's really, I think, probably one of the most worthwhile books you could buy at this moment. This poem then is setting the scene, and he's expressing his despondency at the moment he's in, and the prospects. And it sets the tone for the Rising and for the idea of the Easter dimension, the crucifixion, followed perhaps by the resurrection. Above all, Pearse's vision was concerned with the spiritual nature of Ireland. And that was not an empty piety. It was a very precise understanding that he had, which he had got from Thomas Davis. The interesting thing about reading this book and the way that Pearse talks about all the great heroes, Robert Emmet and Wolfe Tone, it's as if they're like living on the same street, you know, that they're meeting every day, even though there's been decades or centuries between their lives. It's a very interesting thing to see, to look at that and read that in this moment, because you have this very strong sense that this landscape is still there and it's still open. We haven't fenced it in. Freedom has not been arrived at. That's what I feel very much now. And reading Pearse, you have that sense that, you know, you could meet any of these guys in the street, the way he talks about them, and the way he loved them, and the way he loved and respected them, and the way he talked about their character. as the most fundamental thing, their virtue. And these are all young men. Like, they weren't, like, I think Wolfe Tone was about the eldest of them when he died, and he was in his mid-40s at that point. Robert Emmet was 25 when he was hanged. Thomas Davis was 30 when he died. And these guys had left behind, he was a songwriter, Davis was a songwriter, wrote some of the most beautiful speeches. This island of ours is no sandbank. It's an ancient land honoured into antiquity by its valour, its piety, and its suffering. Pearse borrowed his concept of the spiritual nation from Davis, who said that spiritual freedom and intellectual freedom are fundamentally connected, cannot be separated. And therefore, this was when you read these speeches and these essays and read the things he cites from the different other great heroes of our history, you realize how extraordinarily brilliant these guys were, all of them. And they were young men who understood these things in their most profound way. And it's amazing to think about the way that our culture has become so impoverished now, that it's been stripped of young people being able to actually enter into that themselves never mind to replicate it in their own hearts and in their own minds. I'll just read you a couple of little passages from his treatment of Davis and the idea of the spiritual nation. He says, Davis was the first of modern Irishmen to make explicit the truth that a nationality is a spirituality. Tone had postulated the great primal truth that Ireland must be free. Davis, accepting that and developing it, stated the truth in its spiritual aspect, that Ireland must be herself, not merely a free, self-governing state, but authentically the Irish nation, bearing all the majestic marks of her nationhood. That the nation may live the Irish life, both the inner life and the outer life must be conserved. Hence the language, which is the main repository of the Irish life, the folklore, the literature, the music, the art, the social customs must be conserved. Davis fully realised with the Gaelic poets that a nationality connotes a civilization, and that a civilization is a body of traditions. He is thus the lineal ancestor of the spiritual movement embodied in our day in the Gaelic League. Tone had set the feet of Ireland on a steep. Davis bade her in her journey remember her old honour and her old sanctity, the fame of Tara and of Clonmacnoise. Tone is the Irish nation in action, gay and heroic and terrible. Davis stands by the nation's heartside, a faithful sentinel. And that's the tenor of Pearse's entire philosophy of Ireland, that he brings these concepts of intellectual and spiritual freedom together in a way that I think amounts to imagination, that Pearse is fundamentally about the imagination of Ireland, expanding that imagination to begin to understand what's possible and what can be accomplished, and not to place limits on that, which is essentially the religious idea most fundamentally, that, I can live in the world and I can stretch myself fully in that world, and I can see to the end of time, and I can hear from the beginning of civilization and of humanity. And this is all lost in our culture because we are boxed into this square room in which we are told the nature of everything and expected to believe it and accept it. And this fundamentally is what Pearse's vision is about. It's not about just simply gaining ownership of our country, important and all as that is. It's actually getting to create a nation, a place, a people that can live in the world in the most amazing way, a way that perhaps has never been imagined. And that's the nature of the project I still see that is streaming out to be accomplished. That it's not a matter of simply replacing the government. God help us.
Thanks, John. Would you be able to kind of define the big differences between common law and Brehon law for the audience, please?
Yes, I'd be happy to. When I first started studying law, on the very first day of school, in the first class, the lecturer stood up at the top of the hall and she said, "Your first loyalty is to the court, and your second loyalty is to your client." Now, that kind of struck me as odd. And throughout the 3 years that I was doing the undergrad degree, I heard multiple times the lecturer saying, if the law was simple, we'd all be out of the job. And that's why they complicate it on purpose, because the law is simple. It's fundamentally, a man can only be obliged to do that which he has agreed to do. Now, the problem with that is they use legalese to trick us into consenting to all sorts of agreements. Now, on the other hand, the Brehon law was holistic. There was 3 features of Brehon law that stand out. First, it was polycentric, which meant that it originated with the people. It didn't come from the king. It didn't come from a higher authority. It wasn't top down. Secondly, it was poetic, which meant that the judgment had to be given in a form of poetry. And thirdly, all of the judgments had to be based on an observable principle in nature. So there's a big difference between these 2 sets of laws. The common law is centralized, it's top down, it focuses on punishment, whereas the Brehon law focuses on reconciliation. The Brehons had to understand the laws that were in place by the people. And how can a law be formed then? Well, if you can imagine, you're in a community and you're going about your day, doing your daily business. Over time, certain customs would be established. And given enough time, those customs would become a norm, and then eventually they would acquire the force of law. And the interesting thing about the Brehon law was that the laws were considered to be around since time immemorial, or to be as old as the hills or as old as the rocks, which, incidentally, was only about 90 years, or 3 generations. Because by the time the 3rd generation had been born, the law was there since time immemorial. So, I'd like to illustrate this with a few stories. The Brehons were willing to do the difficult calculations. They were very detailed in what they discussed. So the first book that I got on Brehon law, which I actually have with me today, was Lawrence Ginnell, Brehon Law's A Legal Handbook. And he says in the conclusion that a nation's law is an irrebuttable witness to the character, a mirror that cannot be rebuffed. And then, writing more recently in the 1950s, Owen McNeill, who was then the professor of history at UCD, he said, I cannot think of another law in Europe that would describe in such intricate detail the daily lives of the people they concerned. So these 2 quotes tell us something very interesting. First, the law was aspirational. It didn't always work. It wasn't a guide for a perfect society, but they were set down in manuscripts, and previously there was oral tradition. They were set down in manuscripts to try and guide the society, to tell us what do we want to be like, who do we want to be. And secondly, they were hyper-detailed. So that's why we have manuscripts on everything, every facet of human daily life, from marriage to divorce, fosterage and inheritance, and the rights of women were very highly regarded in this. So in the common law, they didn't really have these same attitudes towards women until recently. Women were considered the property of the husband, and marital rape was okay, it was fine. And the death penalty was around up until the 1950s. On the other hand, the Brehon law was a compensatory system, so it meant that you could pay fines and that would resolve the issue. So Brehons they're not really interested in punishing anybody, they're interested in resolving the dispute to create a harmonic rebalance within the society. Now, on the rights of women, there's an ancient mythology called the Leragabala Éireann, and that tells the story of the waves of migration into Ireland. And the first group of people who came in were called the Caesarians, and that was before the flood. And then the first group who came after the Great Flood were called the Partholonians. Partholon was the leader of this group, and one day he was out surveying the land of Ireland, and he left his wife, Gaeilge, at home, and Gaeilge succumbed to temptation. So she slept with the servant, Toppa, who was a low-ranking kinsman, extended kinsman. But to compound that betrayal, they also drank his ale out of a golden straw. Now imagine you're a Partholon, you've just been out surveying the country, and you come back in and you're really thirsty, and you sit down to drink from your golden straw, and you tasted the mouth of Gaeilge and Toppa. What do you think you would do? So he had a fit of rage. And in his fit of rage, he killed the servant Toppa. And he also killed Gaeilge's beloved dog, Mise Éire. And I'd see that there's a bigger, stronger reaction about the dog than the servant, but okay. This is described as the first court case, the first judgment in Ireland. And the Brehon found that it was the right of Gaeilge to recover against her husband, which was unheard of. This is the ancient manuscript. This is prehistory, right? And the thing is, Gaeilge, in her defense, she said, well, leaving me alone like that, it's like leaving honey before a woman, or milk before a cat, or meat before a child, or a tool before a right. One for one. How can you expect me not to act on it? Right? You have a responsibility as well, Partholon. The way the case went was, it was deemed that the adultery of Gaeilge and Toppa was not sufficient enough to excuse the murder of Toppa and the dog. So as restitution, she was awarded an island, and she named it after the dog, Mise Éire. And that island still exists, retains that name to this day, and it's up in Donegal, believe it or not. These laws were not given up willingly. It's not like they were just given up. Sir John Davies, who was the Attorney General for Ireland in 1606 to 1619, he said, there is no nation of people under the sun that does love equal and indifferent justice better than the Irish. Nor will they rest better satisfied with the execution of the law, even if it's against themselves, so that they too can have the benefit and the protection of the law when upon just cause they do desire it. Now, this was a man who was instrumental in abolishing the Brehon law. And then we also had the penal laws, we had the famine, which compounded all of this. And that's probably why we don't speak Irish today, or most of us are unable to understand it. Now, I want to fast forward to 1958, much more recently, and a barrister now was writing an article called The Bench and Bar in Ireland. His name is R.W. Bentham. And he spends most of this article kind of explaining the Irish unruly attitudes towards common law. He tells a story, Lord Justice the Denning or something, he's talking to an Irish man in the court, and he says, young man, what would happen to people in your country who tell lies? And the Irishman, in a characteristically Irish way, said, begor, my lord, they usually win. So he then went on to say, Irish irreverence for law does not stem from sympathy with crime or wrongdoing in general, but rather from the fact that the Irish, who have a longish memory, know that the law in Ireland today is not Irish law. It doesn't command reverence as a native institution, but merely respect nowadays as an essential part of the machinery of government. The thing that makes the Brehon law stand out, and why I love it, is because it was ours. It was quintessentially, characteristically, organically Irish.
How do you see mythology existing or coexisting in the world we're living in today?
I think the first thing for people to know is what mythology actually is. When they hear the word mythology, they think myth, story, fairy tale, something that's just a bit of entertainment in a kind of a narrative form. But mythology is very much more different than that. The great Irish-American mythologist Joseph Campbell, he said that myth was more true than history. And that's true. When we get the history of our country or the history of the world or other countries, what we're getting is the official narrative that's been passed down to us. It doesn't endure. Now, myth comes from a time before we had written conveyance of stories and history. So they were enshrined within mythology as great stories of heroes and adventures, and they all over the world have a remarkable similarity. And this was Campbell's great recognition of mythology, is that they could find stories that happened in Irish mythology that were paralleled in Native American or paralleled in African or paralleled in all over Europe and everywhere. Certain forms and types of identifications pop up over and over again. And that's because mythology, what it really gives us is an archetypal roadmap to the human soul, both on the personal and on the collective level. Now, in terms of Padraig Pearse, he instinctively knew this, or he definitely was aware of it, and it played an enormous role leading up to the Easter Rebellion. He would have been very well aware, as would have many of the people serving under him, that they were taking part in a mythological version of Irish history that was being created in real time. This is the power of mythology. Don't think of it as something from the ancient past. This is something that lives in every one of you now, whether you had a difficult time in your life, recovered from an illness, went through a divorce, terrible things happened to you. You will start looking back on your life and realizing that at one point I met a wizard who gave me some information, whether it was in law or something else, that allowed me to escape a situation. I met a temptress. I met a dragon. I had to steal the dragon's gold. And all these becomes metaphors for things that actually happened and brought you along the struggle. Now, Pearse would have been very much aware of that, as would his brother Willie. And this is why they went to their deaths in such a calm state. It's very difficult to actually understand why people like the two Pearse brothers and Tom Clark had this sense of calm about them when they faced the firing squad. They knew they were playing something very different. They weren't just a story on the evening news. Pearse especially knew that he had planted a psychic message within the zeitgeist of the Irish public that was never going to go away. And all he had to do was perform this ritual of the Easter Rising and bring it to its final conclusion. And the final conclusion was to be executed. Now, that was not failure. That was the final punctuation, the final moment that sanctified or brought the living mythology of the 1916 Rising into manifestation. And there's letters from them towards the end. They say things to their family members like, "The people of Dublin are angry now, but they'll be okay in a while." Now, that came directly from the executions, but not just because of sympathy, because people, someone who might have seen his favorite pub blown up, one day he was pissed off on the Friday, and then by the next day he would go, "That's an awful thing to be shot," and then look around at the ruins of the buildings, and then the next thing you know, he has a picture of the inside of the fighting, like my grandparents had, on his living room wall in the GPO. And that was because Pearse knew this would happen. The 1916 event was not a military one as much as it was a mythological generating one. This was to create a new mythology for a new Ireland that was very different. We were never ever going to beat the British Empire on one-to-one military engagement, but we could win by creating a new psychic or psychological state among the Irish people. And this psychological state would then generate and manifest a tangent that would eventually lead to Michael Collins in Dublin Castle and the tricolour being raised and the Union Jack being taken down. This is a very, very powerful thing. And it's something we have to, when you get used to it and bring it into your own life, like this whole event here seems incredibly mythological to me, almost like in a supernatural sense. And there is a supernatural element to it. There's something going on. Yeah, there's the bread and butter thing of, of Stephen and Suzanne had to get the place and we all had to buy tickets and all had to be sorted out and everything. But there's another sort of hidden stream that lies below that. And within that is the potential to turn this from something that was just going to be a meeting into what I feel an incredibly magical vibe right now. And it's... I've addressed audiences all over the world, and even much bigger ones than this, and I'm actually shaking now. And that's not because I'm nervous because I'm, have stage fright. I'm nervous because I'm realizing the game that we're playing right now. Everything I'm seeing is reminding me of that. So when you start to think, and I've tried to live in a mythological kind of existence in my own life. When you're having a row with the postman, it's hard, but you do try it, But you try to see, okay, it's like what Kevin was saying with the Brehon law. There's a different way of resolving reality. That's not directly confrontational. It's almost like a poetic unfoldment occurs. Like this event, right? The Mayfair didn't bloom, but we went to the ivy-covered tower. What happens in a tower? Wizards do magic. Now, you're not going to tell me that that's just pure coincidence. It's not. It's not. It's just, I can feel an energy in here that's like pulsating. I want to bottle it and take it around the world with me. And I think other people who are not probably in or visiting and looking at this here will probably feel the same way. It's because what we are, we're Irish, we're different. We're odd, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's a thing in that leads, that presents opportunity, Everything gets mythologized here. It's almost like we have something wrong with us. In a good way. Pearse French can write a song about trains being late and it becomes like almost an anthem for the people at a certain time. Rather than complaining about the trains being late, he wrote, Michael, are you right there, Michael, are you right? Do you think he gets home before tonight? This is like, we all grew up with this stuff. It's sad the way, and a lot of us vanished, even I remember as a child in Dublin, we would have poems and sort of nursery rhymes the story of Johnny McGorry, shall I begin it? That's all that's in it. You let that sink in. You're a young child, you're developing your consciousness, and you hear that, and you go, well, what's all that's in it? And you start thinking, oh, the world is a different place than just black and white. It's up to me to finish and complete the story through my conscious exploration of what's all that's in it. And I think all of us here probably have that in common, that at some point we watched the news or looked in the Irish Times or something like that and said, okay, there's a full stop at the end of this paragraph at the end of the story, but there's more to it. And we became like the Johnny McGorry story. Everything is then, from that point on, you're in a kind of a mythological state. You're on a quest. So when you say, okay, the evening news is rubbish, it's all propaganda, the media is rubbish, when you get out of that and what they call waking up and going on research and exploring, what you're doing is you're going on a quest. And it's actually quite a spiritual thing as well, because you will have mistakes along the way. You will listen to some person on YouTube that you might thought they were talking the right thing for a while and then realize, no, I've been led the wrong way there. It's not for me. It's all a learning process. And once you're learning, you're always winning. Because what you're doing is you're creating a comparative mythology for your conscious mind with your subconscious self. Because ultimately that's what it is. It's a dialogue between the consciousness and the subconsciousness. And the mythology for people is a dialogue between the bread and butter everyday life and the system of psychic undercurrent that guides those people. There's even biological reasons for it. There's things like mirror neurons. It's how people have this common understanding among each other in a tribal setting where they can actually all be free association. Carl Jung wrote about this. And we have that too. I mean, I can go anywhere in the world and spot a paddy, and not because the pasty face and all that stuff. I can spot them from behind. And it doesn't matter if they're wearing a Balenciaga ball gown or a GAA jersey. That's a paddy. So that's because we have a different psychic and mythological trajectory that has brought us to this point. And I can feel it in this room really growing again. And I can feel that this is what Pearse wanted. This is what he wanted. He wanted people to stop thinking in terms of, well, if we get into the parliamentary democracy, the British, he wanted to think, no, hold on a second, there has to be a different way of doing this. And what they did was they created a living mythology. And my God, did it work. It absolutely worked. And that's basically it.
You know, in the context of the Mise Éire poem, going back to Pearse, where can you see us going forward? What can we utilise in order to be able to try and carve that new future?
There's something very ugly about what happened in the last few weeks, which is hard to put your finger on. It's got to do with the idea that sticks and stones may break my bones stuff is actually false. It's not true that words can't hurt you. Words of a certain kind are akin to tarring and feathering. And once they're on you, it doesn't matter how innocent you are, you're still tarred and feathered. And everybody makes a space around you because they don't want to brush against you. So there's that element of it that I was very conscious of. However, this morning I was thinking along those lines and feeling a little bit sorry for myself. And then I thought of that morning on the 3rd of May, 1916, when Pearse was going out, not alone knowing that he was about to be shot, but knowing that the next day his little brother would be shot too. What Thomas says is beautiful. It's exactly what I feel about the imagination that Pearse was talking about. We have to concede that at this moment in our culture, that imagination is guttering. The flame is guttering, and it's the pilot light is almost out. It's not completely extinguished, but it's as this day shows. But you know, these people, this Ireland that is here, and this is the Ireland I grew up in. This room is the room I grew up in. I know it, I feel it. But that Ireland I can't find anymore most of the time. It's been drowned out. It's been extinguished. It's been terrified into silence. And we have to really start to work at that. We can't allow these bullies to take our country from us. But even more urgently, we can't allow them to take our imagination and our soul from us, because they're doing that too. That's their way to achieving their ultimate goal. All they care about is the land and the property.
Can I ask you a question there, John?
Yeah.
Because throughout the whole process here, you know, I find a little bit of hope myself in the fact that there's been a very positive response to the negativity. You know, the likes of Kneecap. We have the press now kind of realising they're not in the popular position by completely demonising events like this.
Exactly.
So the tide is turning, and even the common people now are talking.
Yeah, see, I actually don't think anything's changing fundamentally. I think people always knew that what we were saying was true. They always knew that we weren't far right. I mean, I've been around for 50 years. Like, if I was far right, I think people would have noticed it somewhere along the way. You know, if my middle name was Adolf, like, it would have come out, I think, you know. But so people know that this is nonsense. And they know that these skittery journalists are just speaking lies for money. That's all they're doing. What it was a suppression of people's spirit. So they became terrified of speaking or even of thinking, you know, and running away from people who were beginning to talk in a certain direction. You know, I'll see you later. Yeah, nice talking to you. Yeah, good luck, Thomas. That has been the curse of the last few years. The last 15 years, I think this has been going on, since 2011, which is another story. There was a coup here in 2011. I don't know if you noticed. I didn't notice at the time, but I know now that it did happen. I've written about it. We've had the same government ever since, essentially. They change the names over the door every couple of days, or a couple of years, but it's the same government. And they have the same ideology and the same policy and the same outcomes. What's actually happening now is that it's liberation of the spirit. It's been trapped, and now it's been freed. It's not that it's becoming awake in the sense of learning more information. Everybody knew all this stuff all along. It's not permitted anymore to be human. It's not permitted anymore to be Irish. You can't admit to it People get suspicious. You know, and you know, I was talking to a lovely woman here last night about how she because some of her family are involved in this kind of thing, and how she overheard two neighbours passing the house, and one of them said to the other, "That's a fascist house." Did you ever hear anything so nonsensical? A fascist house in Ireland? Well, maybe a Sinn Féin house up in the bird. Yeah, but. And that's the definition of a fascist in Ireland, is somebody who calls everybody else a fascist. So, you know, I feel great about this. That's what I was trying to get at the other day, Tracy, and I didn't want to kind of overstate it or make it, you know, make it into an easy stick to beat me with. But I do think there's something in it, that the spirit that Pearse articulated, his idea of the rising, he knew that they were going to lose. He knew they were going to die. But he knew that triumph would follow, glory would follow. And because if you think about Mise Éire, that poem, he starts with glory and he gets away from it, into fear and pain and sorrow. But he knows that the glory is coming again. And we are now at that point. We could add another line, like, you know, something like, you know, we trusted our beautiful country to the most useless among us. Great my fear. Pearse is a tremendous... One of the things about Pearse is most of my life, he was demonized. From 1966 onwards, they started to demonize him and to parody him. And so when I went into the Irish Times in 1990, I made it a thing that every Easter I was going to write about Pearse, the truth about him, and use those essays to explain to people who he really was and what he was really saying. The worst day in the whole of Irish history was May the 3rd, 1916.
Beyond the legal framework, what can Irish people do today to revive and protect their culture, ensuring that our heritage remains a living guide rather than something that's only left in the past?
I would say first and foremost is to remember who you are. We are the final expression of a long, long line of ancestors. And that bears a bit of responsibility. I like to think of Irish culture and heritage, to use the metaphor that John used, as a flame or a fire. And there's periods of our history when that fire is burning very bright and brilliant and it's hot. And sometimes it's even blinding that you can't look at it. And then other periods of our history, fire has been reduced to just smouldering embers. But so long as there's one man or woman in the country who has a love for Ireland, a love for our language, a love for our music, our love for our traditional sports, that culture can never be extinguished. So we carry that culture in our hearts, and the blood that pumps through our hearts is the blood of our ancestors. So what are you going to do about that? Will you join me in blowing on those embers? Yes. And let's make that fire burn very brightly. I'd like to share a story with you, and I'm going to keep it very quick. There was a chieftain up the north called Turlough Lunach O'Neill, and he was ruling in the 1500s. And one day, some bards came to the boundary of his kingdom. Now, O'Neill clan, if there's any O'Neills in here, you're from a very prestigious lineage. You're descended from warriors and from great leaders and patrons of Gaelic culture. And so the bards came and said, we would like to meet your lord, and we will extol the virtues of the O'Neill clan. And when Turlough heard this, he said, what? All this about my forefathers and nothing of me. Tell them they shall want for nothing in my kingdom, but me they shall not see. I would rather throw lustre back on my family than take anything from it. And we are Irish people, and so we're not just talking about our family names. We're talking about our grandparents' names, our great-grandparents' names, our great-great-grandparents' names. So we are all a big family. And I know families don't always get along, right? But when push comes to shove, when the wolves are at the door, we stick together. So I'm going to ask you to Macorja McClan. The wolves are at the door, so we have to stick together.
How can remembering and retelling our mythology help us navigate change and build resilience in the Ireland of today?
Yeah, I would be optimistic too. And I'll tell you why. We've been here before. It wasn't that long ago either. In, say, the late 1800s, like around 1870, 1880, the Irish as a species had almost vanished. This happened mainly because of the expansion of the rail system and mass communications through newspapers being delivered to every part of the country. And after a while, you would have people in rural Leitrim or rural Kerry having conversations about Lord so-and-so horse running in Newmarket rather than talking about an Irish event because they had been seduced by the culture from outside. There was a great economic expansion too after the famine with the building of the railways and the better building of the communications and so on. Lots of jobs in the government and the civil service. And the Irish were becoming slowly British. I mean, you talk about rebel Cork, but if you see a photograph of Cork before 1919, it was just covered in Union flags. It was famous for it, actually. And when the King of England came in the early 1900s, he was a superstar. Now, what happened was there were people in Ireland said, you know what, we're actually not being Irish anymore. And they saw what happened in Scotland. The British aristocrats had made a false sort of national identity for Scotland. All that thing you see about, like, you know, tossing the caber and sword dancing and all that stuff, and kilts with cannons on them, that's all completely made up by British aristocrats to tame the Scots. And it's not really their culture. Their culture was very similar to ours. So the Irish, great people here like Douglas Hyde and Lady Gregory, decided we better get our own real stuff here and get it out there. And so they created an amazing organisation called the Gaelic League. Now, what started as a very humble thing, we're starting from a much, much bigger base, and they were starting from a tiny base. The Irish language had almost completely vanished. There was no books being published in Irish. There was nothing. Irish crafts and everything were vanishing. So it wasn't just a case of them like reviving the Irish language and poetry and stuff like that. They also used to do things like put on exhibitions at the RDS in Dublin. And they would bring people from all over Ireland, whether you're a basket maker or a weaver or a glass blower or an ironmonger, a blacksmith, a farrier, and they would give demonstrations in the RDS to people who would have been middle-class people in Dublin who didn't know about these things. They didn't know about them, you know? And so they would see that. And then there was also great exhibitions of things like Celtic, what we call Celtic art, with the zoomorphic graphics and all the design. And suddenly people were like, that's ours, that's ours. And you had a revival of Irish alphabetic type styles of writing, and it started to branch into theatre, it started to branch into poems, it started to branch into every aspect of life. And it happened at a remarkably quick rate. So you talked about, like, when they started it, the King or Queen of England was firmly on the stamps. By the time it was over, we had ancient art from Ireland on our stamps and on our money. And that didn't take long. Didn't take long at all. It was a long, hard struggle in between, but they could not put that out. Why? Because the archetypal, mythological thing lasts better and lasts longer. It travels underneath the material, real-world things. And I think that's a great inspiration to us. I'm a great believer in theories like the 100 Monkeys. I know it gets poo-pooed on and things like that, but I really do believe that if every one of us went out from here and thinking in our hearts that, you know, I'm part of an Irish Gaelic revival, whatever, in the modern sense, it does influence other people, but not in an evangelical way where you bash them over the head. You know, the Gaeilge's got a bad name back in the day for that. We don't have to be like that. We can be very casual about it. And it'll be a beautiful thing when it happens, because it does happen. Because let me tell you something. If there's one thing that our culture has, it's beauty. We should be very aware of that. We have a beautiful culture, okay? I'm talking about not just stories and poetry, but the aesthetic. We've done it all. In terms of the visual, literary, and written arts, we have that. We have that in spades. Very few other cultures in Europe have it. I'm often envious of Italians, the way Italians like, you know, our culture's the best of the French. And you know, I know the English would say, well, they're very boastful. No, they're right. And we have to learn to be right as well. And we have to learn to be right about that and say, well, here we are, this is what I am, that's the end of it. Isn't it lovely? You don't like it? Fair enough, go off and do something else. In my lifetime, I was born in the mid-60s. There has been a war on beauty. I watched my city being demolished, my hometown Dublin, and replaced with appalling boxes, okay? And most of them were done by the government. Dublin Corporation demolished Wood Quay. Underneath, they found the largest Viking city in the world, and then they built 2 pillboxes on top of it. This is where the vandalism happens. There's a war. They're using ugliness. But always, 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 beauty will come to the fore. Why? Because of one of the principles of the Brehon laws that Kevin said, it's in accordance with nature and natural law. And they can do anything they want, but if you have a beautiful aesthetic, culture, sense of self, and it's in accordance with a natural thing, remember the Celtic art, it's flowing. It flows with nature. Affluence, the word affluence comes from a French word, affluer. It means to flow. And we have a great affluence of culture. And all we have to do is turn that trickle into a torrent just by giving it life.
Spongere nach in